We are now moving to item 7, and just a time check. How are people feeling about going till 1 o'clock, which is 45 minutes? We can also break for lunch, but if we can get through to 1 o'clock, then we have lunch and we're in closed session. My preference would be to keep going. If someone needs to, take up, feel free to step away. But we're going to move forward with item 7, and I'm so pleased to see Scott Chen and Lisa Blatnick presenting together.
This is
great.
Landmark stuff here.
The collaborative model, and we have 20 minutes set aside for this, so really like to state at 20 minutes. It's informational item.
We will stay within the 20 minutes. And,
Lisa, welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's see, is the slide presentation coming up?
We can.
They're going to start doing it to us, though.
Would be a little bit too much pressure. So why don't we get started, because the timer's on. I wanted to begin with this slide because we did trademark that logo. A lot of people in the office want to use the word pillars, but we had trademarked the logo. It's called the Pillars Project.
Always looking for
Where's
revenue
the
streams.
PM? We need to have.
We're looking for revenue streams. Not yet, but the reason why I wanted to start with the slide, because, and I credit Jan Spano and her team for developing the logo. It actually has meaning. And if you looked at the horizontal lines on the top, that's the collaborative model investment strategy. Now the columns or the pillars below it are supporting the strategy. And I think that's a good way to think about the collaborative model from an investment strategy perspective. And then the pillars project, which really is surrounding that and supporting the project. So I'm just going to begin by saying that this is the vision of the board, that we put the collaborative model pillars project as a priority, and it gains organization-wide support. And I think that everyone really has been on board with that, and that has happened. Hopefully you'll see that throughout the presentation. The only other thing to bring up is that many of the board members have asked for not increasing, but measurement and reporting. And so what we've tried to do is develop a reporting framework from a bottoms-up perspective, and we'll go through that today. I just wanted to go through a number of things before handing off to my partner here, Lisa. And that's just to talk about the origination of the Pillar Project, why we're here, what's at stake, and then move into the different pillars in the project itself. So you know that the collaborative model is an investment strategy to manage more of our assets internally. It covers all the asset classes. And there are three legs of the stool. There's the cost savings, control of risk, and increased returns. And so if you think about that definition that we've set forward, what is internal management? 85% of, for example, what we do in fixed income is internal management. Glenn and his team manage that. And we've built a whole team around that, a trading desk, portfolio managers, et cetera. On the private market side, it's not necessarily cost efficient for us to build that team or effective. So what we do is partner in various ways, joint ventures, custom accounts, co-investing, partial or majority ownership stakes in different areas. And so if you looked at the costs, and I think this is what's at stake, is that roughly the $1.7 billion we spent in 2018 to manage our assets, $1.4 billion was from external management as we go outside and hire managers. And that was 84% of the cost structure. And if you think about the internal management, roughly $275 million we spent internally. So from that perspective, and you'll notice the new hybrid area, which again, that describes more of the private market partnerships that we've architected versus the internal direct, which is mainly the public markets, both public equities and fixed income. So that's really what's at stake. And you've heard us estimate that if we were to look forward over the next 5 years, we hope to save roughly $200 to $300 million in cost savings. And if you add that up over time, if you think about our $108 billion roughly unfunded liability, that might take about $20 billion of that chunk, which is very, very significant. So we'll likely be measuring this in two ways. If you think about number one, the cost report for the fee savings, But also, if you think about the value added, which we'll be discussing more and more over the next quarters, how do we add value? That's primarily going to come from the total fund. How far do we exceed the benchmark? And so as an example, this year, this fiscal year to date, we're up roughly 4.4%, exceeding the benchmark by roughly 44 basis points. So we're above our 40 basis point target. So clearly there's a lot at stake here. And essentially, as we think about the Pillars project and that range of can we achieve 200 to 300 million of cost savings, there's a delta in terms of how we do that and how we succeed as an organization from the Pillars project. So we've talked about, in the past, why are we here? While I hope it would be easy for us to execute this plan, there are two challenges that we've identified. Number one is the competition, and number two, the regulatory environment that we work in. And so if you think about one of the largest changes in the investment management industry over the last 20 years, it's been the rise of global competition. And so I'm not going to go through these maps, but essentially we started with competition more at a US level, and it's transferred globally. So we now compete against global organizations that are larger than us. We're 25th at $254 billion on the asset list. So we're not quite as large when you think about the global scale. But more importantly, they have more resources than us, oftentimes with much larger staff sizes than we, to bear down on the transactions. And it's about the expertise that they can bring and the resources. Moreover, we work within a regulatory framework in the state of California, and our competition, generally speaking, does not have any constraints. So if I think about our goal and the goal of CalSTRS, we want to be the partner of choice, and that's going to bring a lot of value to the investment organization and CalSTRS. Can you think about us being the first call to a transaction? Think about us working with the best partners and maybe getting a look at the best transactions. How can we get there? We need to match the nimbleness of our competitors. And that really involves an aspirational goal for us to go from a best-in-class organization within the US to a world-class pension fund, necessitating, essentially the ownership not only by the board, the investment team, but the whole organization. And so that really was the origination of the Pillar projects. As the investment team, as well as the rest of the organization, we've identified 4 pillars that are going to be critical for us to succeed and for that support to be brought to the CalSTRS collaborative model. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to my partner in crime, Lisa Blatnick.
Yeah, Lisa Blatnick, Chief of Admin Services. Thank you so much for hearing about this today. We're really excited to partner. I'm really excited to partner with Scott as the executive sponsor for this project. And it makes sense that I am the one that does this because 3 of the pillars reside under admin services. So the human resources pillar, the travel pillar, and the procurement pillar, all 3 reside under my responsibility. But all of the executives in the organization are committed to this project. And because of what it can do to the organization, how it can support our investment team in this new strategy that they're looking to do. So I want to start by the project governance. As you can see, the board is the oversight of the project. And further along in the conversation, we'll talk about the number of times that we'll be coming to you to talk about the progress that we've made on this. Scott and I, of course, are the project sponsors, but you'll notice the pillar sponsors are all made up of executives as well. I think that, again, goes back to the commitment of the organization to make sure that this strategy is very successful. And then there's pillar leads underneath all of those pillar sponsors that are actually the groups that are meeting with the working groups for each pillar to assess all the activities that need to be done in order for us to achieve our overall vision and goal. Each pillar also has a charter. The project has a charter, but each pillar has a charter, and that identifies the scope, the governance, the benefits, and the roles and responsibilities for each of the pillar groups. And this slide really depicts just how widespread the participants are in making this successful. So I'll give you an example. If you think about the HR pillar, to me, which is one of the most important pillars of this whole project, because that's the one that's going to bring in the talent that we need to actually implement this strategy. We all obviously need recruitment, we obviously need talent acquisition, but we also need our marketing team and our communications team to develop a strategy that's going to get people that are working in global organizations right now, maybe not in the US, to want to come to CalSTRS. So we want to brand what it means to work here. So that's an example of something that also needs to be done in the human resources pillar, and you can see all of the different people that are going to be involved in that. When you look at the procurement pillar, we've got disbursements involved. We don't want to develop a process in procurement that works for the organization, but we get to the point where it's time to pay the bill to the vendor, and now there's a problem. So it's really about getting all of the right people in the room to make sure that we're looking at the pain points of all of our processes holistically, to make sure that everybody that is going to have a role in this is involved in how this is going to be structured. As Amy mentioned before, and I think on the previous item, we've talked about the success of our strategic plan and the framework that we have in place for the strategic plan to actually govern our business processes as well as the initiatives that we get done with our strategic plan. And we felt there was a need to do the same thing for this project. We really needed a reporting structure so we could make sure that everybody in the process was accountable for their piece of the puzzle. So that's what we developed. I think this project started really back in June, and then the investment team had gotten together and determined across asset classes who's going to be responsible for each of these pillars. An example would be Mike DeRay is on the travel pillar, which makes sense because he and his team probably travel the most in the investment office on all the assets that they're doing due diligence on. And so they kind of developed their own groups or teams per se. And I think by about August, we realized that we wanted to make sure that everybody in the organization that had a piece in the success of this project were involved. So we got ESM involved. It was actually Cassandra Licknock's idea to have enterprise strategy management come in and say, hey, how can we facilitate some work groups so we get all the right people in the room, we develop all the pain points of our current processes, and figure out ways to improve the efficiency, like Scott said, to make us more flexible and more nimble. This is a great strategy they're embarking on, and we want to make sure from an administrative perspective we can support them in achieving their goals. So that's what happened in about August, where every pillar actually started having facilitated sessions with ESM, where we brought in working groups and we determined who the pillar sponsor was going to be, who the pillar lead was going to be, but an opportunity for everybody involved in these processes to put up on the board, what's my pain point? Because the pain points in investments might be different than the pain points in procurement. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to make sure we knew what our clear vision was and what the objectives of the project were. I can tell you we've done lots of process improvement already. So we're able to leverage a lot of things that we've already done. In procurement per se, we've had continuous improvement team meet with us to actually look at every step in our procurement process, from the time there's a request to an executed contract. We've broken each step down by what's governing this step. Is it public contract code? Is it regulation? Or is it our own internal policy? What we want to make sure that we do is get out of our own way. So if there's anything that's precluding us from moving forward that we have control over, we definitely want to look at that as well. I'm going to give a shout out to someone in procurement, Penny Palmertree, who actually did take that flow chart from end to end, which probably was 200 steps in this process, and she actually was able to identify that for us, which has been a real big help in us thinking about the different areas and how we can make improvements. So every pillar has a vision, we have objectives, we have deliverables, we have action plans. Every action plan has a name associated with it. So every step to achieve that deliverable has somebody that's accountable for that piece of it. And so I just think the framework is something that's just it's a step to make us successful in the overall project, and I'm very optimistic. I can tell you that throughout this process with all the groups that we've been meeting with, all the business areas are all in. We've all bought into this concept, and we're all working really hard to make sure that we can bring it to fruition. This is just kind of an idea of a reporting example. So kind of like the strategic plan, we're going to use red, yellow, green. And so as we report out on this project, that's kind of the stoplight chart that we'll be using. Very similar to what we do already in the strategic plan, very similar to what we do in all of our operational performance reviews as well. So we've got a customer service performance review as well as an operational performance review, and we use the same kind of reporting method for that. Again, it's something we're all familiar with, and as was shared earlier, it's something you're familiar with, so it should make keeping progress on this project easier. Again, this is another reporting example of the collaborative model overall, and then maybe what we would do is show the number of objectives for a particular, for this example, it was human resources particular pillar. What's the progress on that, and then how does it roll up to the collaborative model overall? And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Scott to talk about what we've done so far.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. And so I just wanted to cover a few points here that, number one, this is really exciting because it's the first ever investment branch collaboration across all of the CalSTRS business units, really in scale. And I think there are a lot of people that have been involved in making this happen. I'm just going to name a few of the names and talk about the storyline from that, but I wanted to thank Jack and his team for really catalyzing the business units and making this one of the big three projects within CalSTRS, and giving me Lisa here. I think he either volunteered or voluntold Lisa to be part of this unit, and I'm really thrilled to be working with her. Lisa's been great to work with and a fantastic leader. And I go back just to simply a conversation that we had in Cassandra's office 6 or 7 or even 8 months ago, a roundtable with Lisa and Deborah and a number of other folks, and outlining that we could take the strategic planning process as a way to develop a reporting mechanism that all of our staff is familiar with, as well as the board. And that's what we've done. And so I think it's exciting to see, as Lisa said, components coming into this, like the ESM group, the Enterprise Strategy Management, and the PMO office. We've really built a structure around this to create project charters, not only for the overall pillar project, but each of the pillars to define the scope, to understand the prioritization, to develop that organization support and understand the roles amongst everyone. So in any event, I'm very excited. There's a lot of other things that we've done to push this, and I guess I would be remiss also not to identify Glenn and Paul, who have really helped me to organize a lot of the pillar project from an investment perspective. But I think that the real thanks goes to the entire, or maybe the majority of the organization, because there's been a lot of work done across the organization, and I couldn't possibly name all those names, but you saw all those business units. So anyways, I just wanted to end on the timeline. We planned, you see the star, so the pillar project measurement has officially begun. And that means that we want to update the board on our progress, as Lisa mentioned, in the reporting framework every 6 months. So our first update will come in July, and then January 2021. With that, I'd like to hand it off to the board for any questions.
Thank you. Sharon, Gail, and then Joy. Sharon?
So we remember Business Direct? So that when I was reading this, I was thinking back, I've been on the board 8 years, and I just remember, I think when I was chairing the investment committee, just, there's just a lot of challenges. And so just reading through this, it kind of just made my heart happy to feel like there's, I just think any organization gets siloed as it gets larger, and it tends to kind of, everyone's got their stuff they need to get done, and there can be frustrations with that. And so this just really excites me, especially with the expansion and just how we're growing internally. To see executives sort of collaborating, I think that's just, I'm an educator, we love collaborating, it's great. I think it's healthy for an organization that's growing to be doing this kind of work. The one comment and I guess question I have is, this is an extensive information item. I really appreciated all of the information. I think the question I had in the back of my head the whole time reading it was how you see the role of the board in this process. When I look at those pillars, there's a lot of operational pieces, which I've learned enough over time that is not my job. It's not it's not operational. So when we talk about like reporting process, I guess I wonder, and I'm open to ideas, but how you see the board. I guess I don't want to micromanage. You're doing all this work internally. We trust you to do the work. It seems important to hear back at some point. Every 6 months, is that too much, not enough? I don't know, but it seemed, my first reaction to that is, and maybe as it starts, we want to hear in 6 months, but I guess I was just trying to understand how you see the board's role. I mean, obviously it's oversight, so we can read it and make sure it's happening. I guess I'm just I don't want to get too into the weeds with this project. I know it's new, so obviously when things are new, I think there's more involvement from us on oversight. To me, the work that you did was, I mean, it's like a student doing a very, lots of bars and graphs and tons of information on something that you just did a lot of work, which we appreciate. But again, I wonder if you could speak to how you see the role of the board moving forward, because to me, you're executives for a reason, so we trust that you will do this work. So the reporting piece is a question I had in terms of the frequency.
Sure.
I could jump in just to make a quick comment, and I think the board has really served a very appropriate role up to this point in creating the vision and including it into the strategic plan. And many members like Joy and others have just requested the measurement and reporting aspect of it, which I also think is part of the oversight role. But the question might be a frequency. Would you like us to update you every 6 months, once a year, 4 times a year? I think it would really be up to the board to decide.
I think Joy and I can chat a little bit about the frequency. I think at this point, every 6 months is appropriate. The green light, red light, yellow light format around these 4 pillars, that which gets measured gets done, and that's really what we want to do. We know this is an important initiative for the organization. We're extremely appreciative of the fact that people are truly collaborating across the organization. And in speaking with our Chief Executive Officer yesterday, he talked about the impact that this will actually have on other parts of the organization. So the execution is important, but it's red light, green light, yellow light, progress over time, because that which gets measured will get done. So, this is really detailed at this level. I wouldn't expect that this level of detail and granularity will need at the next report.
Traffic light.
Gail.
So I think I'm in the yellow light category. We are really enthusiastic and support the collaborative model. I do think I think I have had this conversation a lot. The Department of Finance really wants to help you get here. We recognize the savings. We do think that there are always parallel processes with the state, and what we'd like to see ourselves doing is really helping you merge those two. So I think in that, if you could just, for us, elaborate on the need for additional staff in the Pillars project versus what we've already talked about. The CalSTRS, as Julie presented to us, has a really significant BCP with 27 new positions, and we're supporting that and want to see that move forward. So for us, it's just a question of how we can really help you move in this direction. And I do think it's kind of important for the board to understand the 2 processes that go on kind of at the same time, one at the board level and then the other at the state level. And that is part of our responsibility, I think, on this board, is just to make sure we're helping navigate through that. So if you could just elaborate on that, we'd appreciate it.
Sure. I think that the last time that Julie presented a BCP, there was 5 additional positions that support the Pillars project. I know it's confusing about the collaborative model versus the Pillars project. The collaborative model is really, the resources that are going to be needed for that is really about the strategy, right? About having the new people on board that can do the co-investing and that sort of thing. The Pillars project has 5 additional positions that were requested that we would get on July 1st of 2020. And those 5 positions, there were 3 in talent acquisition, there was 1 in procurement, and there was 1 for the general counsel. So those 5 positions are positions that we anticipate that we would need to not only support all of the research and the activities that are surrounding the inputs into this project, but at the same time supporting the ongoing recruitment efforts, the ongoing procurement efforts that we may need. That additional procurement person was someone for investments. Right now there's 2 dedicated people for procurement and investments, and we thought an additional one may be needed with the way we're going to change our business. So those are 5 positions that were, I think, if Julie's here, were within the 27 that we were asking for. And those are separate and apart from the asks for the actual people and investments that are going to be doing the work. Does that help?
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. So I think it is, Mr. Chair and Ms. Higo, when you guys are just talking about how to, is that we're cognizant of how to support you and also and also what you're looking for in the future. So I'm wondering if the plan is that you plan to ask for more positions sort of annually, or is this, we're going to see how it goes and report after that? So was there these 27 positions and then we'll see how that all works out for 2020 to 2021, or is this kind of an annual re-upping of commitments and resources?
Well, I would say for the at least I can speak for my positions that I've asked for, and that's in procurement and in human resources. I would say at this point we think that's enough, but it would be a wait and see approach on how things go down the road. Again, that's apart from the positions that investments is asking for to do the work. But for now, I would say that I think we did a lot of research and lots of inputs that went into that BCP, but I do feel comfortable that we have the right number of positions to help support this effort.
Great.
And so, Gail, I think your questions were focused on the Pillars project. Would you like the investment division outlook relative to the human capital?
If you don't, is that okay? Okay, yes,
Yeah.
please.
Yeah, so this fiscal year, we had asked for 27 positions, 12 which we had planned for, and 15 which we pulled forward. That would leave 16 remaining for the next fiscal year. And then once that is exhausted, we would likely come back and create a new BCP plan, which covers roughly a 5-year period. So we'll likely be trying to put that together in the next several months and then bring it forward.
Great.
I think the confusion may have been that there was 27 positions asked for,
Mm-hmm.
but not those 27 positions weren't all investment positions, and there was a drawdown that was from the previous BCP, but I think the numbers were aligning up almost equally, so I could see where there could be some confusion on, is that fair, Julie? Do you want to come up and?
I appreciate that clarification.
I think the bigger issue is
I
just
think-
the investment staffing.
Julie, I think it's
Yeah.
enough now.
Are you okay?
We're good. Apart from the BCP process that Scott mentioned, we'll actually come over to finance and go over that 3-year plan. We did that on the original plan with Michael, was that? Yeah, Michael was the director then. Yeah. So we'll do that with you when we've got this plan organized, and then we'll convert that into a BCP process.
Great, thank you, I really appreciate that. And thank you for all your work.
Yeah, no problem.
George.
Just really briefly, thank you very much for the report, and it's a tremendous amount of time I can tell has been spent on this, and I just underscore what Sharon said, that the collaboration among everybody in the organization is really great to see. Just a couple of comments regarding reporting to the board. I agree with what Mr. Chair said, that I think in the future we don't need micro level reporting. I think I just wanted to ask that when you present, there are so many objectives and goals and steps and actions that can be scored to produce the red, yellow, green, that having some context around impact or intensity, like if you're red on one thing, but if it's something that's not as material to the success of the collaborative model, that kind of context will be important for us, as opposed to having us say, well, what's happening? And then also, if you have items that are in the red, it doesn't necessarily have to be in writing, but when you present, just talk a little bit about what your go-to-green strategy is, so we know, where you know the red and you're thinking about how to get it back on track.
Sure. The thing I would also add is we have quarterly operation performance reviews with the executives and many of the directors in the organization that really talk about operational metrics, which include a lot of these same different aspects of the organization. And so what we're going to do is we're going to make those every 6 months, and in the interim months, we're going to actually report out on this project at that same forum with the same directors, inviting more of the investment staff. So all of the executives will be hearing progress on the project every 6 months, as will the board. So I just wanted to make sure that you're left with a sense that there's going to be a lot of high-level visibility into the progress and making sure that things are moving along.
Great, thank you.
doing all of that and overseeing our expansion as well.
I have help.
Lisa Blumen.
I have plenty of help.
I know, you
woman.
guys are doing a great job. Appreciate the updates on the Pillar project.
Sure.
Continued success. Thank you. Next item is item 8, which is the Global Equity Active Risk Budgeting Overview. And Stephen and Mika will also be participating, and there's an accompanying memo from Makita. This is an information item, really what the goal of is to be able to get to the finish line and implementation for an active risk budgeting by July 1st of 2020. So this information and an update, and then Makita, please, will weigh in as well. June Kim?
Thank you. I'm June Kim, the Director of Global Equity. As the chair just said, this is an information item on the topic of a global equity active risk budget. We started reviewing this topic with the board a year ago in January of 2019, and we've had a few education sessions since. When we last talked about this was in September, and we had a very good discussion. There are a few follow-up items requested by the board, and so I will start off with some brief comments and then hand it to Makita, who will do most of the presentation today. One of the items asked was information on what other funds are doing, if funds are doing an active risk budget. Makita touches upon that in their memo. Another thing that was requested was how the global equity portfolio and/or policy would change if we were to move to a global active risk budget in the global equity portfolio. This slide, this was also in the staff memo. This is a portion of the existing global equity policy. And currently, the policy has static target allocations for active and passive management in US and in developed markets, non-US, and then as well as in emerging markets. So that middle column, you'll see that in the US, the target is around 30% active with a range so that we can manage it. And then developed markets, we have more active management, it's 50-50. And then emerging markets, there in our policy, it says that it should be 100% active. And so that means all of our emerging markets is managed by external active managers currently. Now, how this would change if we move to an active risk budget is it would be that table and those static targets would be replaced with language. This is just an example where it would be more of a range that's established that we're allowed to manage the portfolio with tracking error within this range of 20 to 50. And this is an example. We'll come back with the first reading of the policy with the exact ranges and some more details. But you see, it does go away from the granular detail and into this more overarching, this is how much risk budget you have, and we have more flexibility within it as far as the active and passive mix. Now, we don't plan any big changes to the portfolio as a result of the policy change. We do think that it will give us more flexibility to go into as well as out of investment opportunities. One thing that we do plan to add is some passive emerging markets exposure. And related to that, another item that was requested was what would the potential fee savings be if we were to move some of our emerging markets exposure from all active to some passive. And the estimate for that we have is about 40 to 50 basis points of potential fee savings. And what that equates to is $4 to $5 million for every $1 billion in assets we were to move from active to passive emerging markets. And that's a good amount. So the other items that were requested by the board and we'll address in a future meeting are how you could monitor an active risk budget. Geraldine and Josh earlier gave you a little preview of the type of reporting that is being added into the CIO report. We'll come back with some more information about what type of reporting would be presented. And then also what other policies would be changed if we were to move to the active risk budget. We'll come back with that. And the last bullet, this will take place probably over a longer period, as Chris mentioned. It's a discussion about ESG-related items were we to have passive emerging markets exposure, because that would considerably increase the number of holdings that we have versus currently, and China being the largest country in emerging markets. So we'll have an ongoing discussion with the board about those topics. And with that, I'll hand it over to Makita. The second PowerPoint, please.
Thank you. Mika Malone, Makita Investment Group. I'll keep my comments relatively brief. We're obviously both here to be able to answer questions have just a short slide presentation trying to provide some context around a lot of the items that you've heard from June and the rest of her team on what does this risk budget really mean, and why is global equity kind of the appropriate place to start within the program. If you, oh wow. I didn't know it spun. Sorry. On slide 2, just in terms of background, I think that Makita makes clear in our memo, but I just wanted to highlight for the board, in terms of risk budgeting, this is a growing area within the industry. Makita is very supportive of staff's desire to move in this direction. As we walk through my several slides, I'll highlight a few areas that I think specifically make this a tool that will help staff better manage the portfolio and therefore allow the board to have better transparency into kind of where the risks in the portfolio come from. When you do see risk budgeting in the marketplace, it is sometimes done solely at the total fund level and more often done at the asset class levels, which will then kind of roll up into a total fund type of risk budget. I think talking about global equity first, as you've seen from several of the presentations today, that is the largest component of the risk in your portfolio. It makes a lot of sense to start here in terms of focus. In terms of where peers are at, I mentioned it's a growing trend. When we survey kind of the 30 largest US public pension funds, 7 today have explicit risk budgets, and that's been growing. I'd say the movement is in this direction. There are at least a handful of others discussing the topic today. And so I think that you'll see those numbers increase over time. And again, I think that just increases the relevance of these conversations and kind of CalSTRS movement to take a look at what this would mean for your portfolio. So let's talk about what it means from an implementation standpoint. And we noted this in our memo, there are really 5 items that you have to think about where to implement. And as I think I've noted, I think global equity makes a lot of sense. This is a big driver of both the returns of your portfolio and the risk of your portfolio. So once you kind of focused in on that area first, you need to look at things like benchmark selection. As June mentioned, at the next meeting, you'll have a little bit more context in terms of what the risk level would be, which is number 3. And then also getting down, I'll skip to 5 and then come back to 4. But in terms of monitoring, what does that look like? I thought the snapshot provided in the CIO report was really helpful. Hopefully, as you see more of that, you'll start to just get a flavor for how this will change the way that you're viewing the performance of the program over time. In terms of additional considerations, you have to think about, it's not just as simple as looking backwards and seeing what the risk was and Makita coming in or someone else or staff coming in at the end of every 6 months and saying, here's where you stood on December 31st from your kind of active risk standpoint, and here's what your target was. Obviously, from a daily monitoring standpoint, your staff has to come up with methods to be looking at what they expect the risk of the portfolio to be and then to decide whether they're in that range. So I think it's important to just think about the differences in that approach versus just being able to look at a snapshot in time and say, were you or were you not in that range? I want to just finish really on the slide about the mechanics. This has really the same items that I mentioned, but I wanted to note that what you have to do next, we've talked a lot about this and we'll take additional questions, but the next steps are really trying to kind of get there, right? To see policy language that shifts this and removes the static constraints within the global equity portfolio. I want to note one thing about that. It feels like a big change, right? Now you have 70-30, 100% in emerging markets is active. The board has spent a lot of time and spent a lot of years looking at the portfolio in that way and kind of outlining the risk profile in that way. I think one thing that may come to mind as a board member is by shifting to, say, it's 40 basis points as a target risk level or 50 basis points, does that change the way that the staff feels incentivized to manage the portfolio? Would this lead to a desire or at least the possibility that they'd want to increase the risk to try to move towards their compensation benchmarks, et cetera? When I think of it today, you dictate active and passive, but from June's perspective, within the emerging markets portfolio, they could take on as much risk as they want with those active managers. And within the EFA portfolio, the portion that's active, those active managers could be very active and take on a lot of risk. By implementing a risk budget across the levels, you actually have a much better view and your staff is more limited in how that risk can be utilized. So they can put it where they believe they can get the best bang for the buck, but they can't take on more risk than you might have visibility into. So I actually see it as potentially reducing the possibility of that sort of behavior in staff or in a program. In terms of the monitoring rules, I think this is really kind of the next piece of the equation and what you'll see at future meetings. We have to figure out how that daily monitoring will take place, who will be responsible for it, and how then it will kind of roll up into reporting to you. So in thinking about what that means, there's a little graphic at the bottom of the page, but when you're approving what that risk budget level is, it's just always a trade-off, right? The higher the risk budget is, higher potential outperformance might be, right? Alpha in the program, but also more risk in the program. It would be the same way of increasing your active exposure today to all active across all portfolios. That would obviously increase the risk from where you're at. This, I think, is a better way of approaching it, which is to say, maybe June wants passive exposure in emerging markets. Maybe there is room for lower active risk managers to kind of balance out some of the higher risk managers that are in the portfolio today. And that just makes a nice spectrum of opportunity within the program. I'll just close by saying that from Makita's perspective, risk budgeting is a very appropriate tool for you to utilize. I think it's more efficient than traditional models of just active versus passive, this much in various categories. I do believe it's a growing trend in the industry, and we certainly support staff and look forward to continuing to collaborate as you look through to that reporting structure.
Thank you, Mika. So great slides and great points in terms of what we need to do and the mechanics of going the next steps. So, Bill?
June, I just have one question. I'm a big supporter of this active risk budgeting. I think it's the right way to go, and I anticipate that our next meeting will have a proposal and we'll be able to look at that and move on it, I hope. But I have one question about the emerging markets, and it's it's been traditionally my understanding has been that the amount of financial data that you get in the emerging markets is sometimes not as trustworthy as it is in the Western markets. And so how are we going to deal with that if we increase our passive investment in the emerging markets? And maybe I'm all wet on that.
No, there's a lot of the community that has that view or that they've heard of it, but that has improved greatly over the past couple of decades. The amount
that far behind.
Well, no, it's a continuing evolution of the market.
It's all right, June.
Let me just get the foot out for a second. Okay. So,
No.
It's a continuing evolution of the markets, but I think also the technology and globalization of the markets has improved the quality of the data greatly. It's not that we're going to move the majority, or I don't anticipate that we'd move the majority of the portfolio into passive, but we do need the flexibility. It would be to our benefit to have the flexibility to have some, and we like having some active exposure in emerging markets. It's the least efficient market. That's the area where we have the best chance of beating the benchmark. So it makes sense philosophically. And why we use active investment managers, they have boots on the ground where they have native language speakers to go through this financial data, et cetera. It's not somebody sitting in Sacramento who's running this. So the passive component, it is different. It's passive. It's truly passive. We just want beta exposure. We just want exposure to that broad market. But we'll still have a lot more active because we view it as an attractive area to try to beat the benchmark.
Okay, thanks.
Keith?
Yeah, I'm not saying that what we have right now is the best thing either, because I don't know, but it's what we have. So I think the concept that I would like some information later as we consider this, it could just be to me, it doesn't have to be to everybody else, but the thing about risk is that it implies that there is a known outcomes or known causes, effects, and that it can kind of say something that it's going to result from whatever step you take. Versus, I've seen where uncertainty is you just don't know what's going to happen. And I'm not sure whether or not what affects investments is in fact measurable or not, or foreseeable or not, or that we actually know what happens. So there's a level of uncertainty, which means you don't know. And there's a level of risk is where you could probably predict this is an outcome of this action. So the perhaps caution that one is faced with is, does this kind of risk budget, is it really risk, or is there a level of a portion of that that's uncertain, that then this risk analysis would be giving an illusion of mathematical certainty or some kind of certainty to something that isn't measurable? And then what are the pros and cons of that to us as we're making these decisions to do that? Now that may be exactly what's happening now under our current analysis, whatever 70% active, passive. But then that also gets to how much faith do we have in this determination of how we measure risk? Because that, as I recall, in 2007 or 2008, that whole measurement was invalid. So you don't need to answer it now, but that's the kind of information I would like to get comfortable with this concept. But I think it makes sense, but I just need that confidence.
Maybe I can make one comment, and then we could certainly follow up with additional data. I'd make the first comment is really that, we're really thinking of this in terms of relative risk, right? So absolutely, it's very difficult to know, one, where the next risk will come from, and two, how much exactly are you taking on at any given time. I think that is one of the challenges of a risk budgeting approach. I think it's a challenge that you can overcome with good data and kind of forward-looking expectations. But the real key is that all of that market level risk is captured in the benchmark. So if that's the ACWI IMI, the All Country World Index, that captures kind of the risks out there in the market. And then what staff is tasked with doing is saying, where do we want to spend our dollars and just take on the beta of that market risk? And where do we want to focus our dollars to either try to mitigate some of the risks or capitalize on them in other parts of the portfolio? So, I see it as a way to manage that overall risk, but absolutely the calculation of it is a complicating factor for sure.
I just want to add one or two comments as well.
One is fine.
One and a half.
Almost lunchtime.
I really perceptive comment on the distinction between risk and uncertainty, and topic for another day, I'm sure, but there's a huge difference between risk and uncertainty. And what matters to you as investment decision makers is much more so uncertainty than risk. When we and investment professionals talk about risk in a portfolio, we're typically looking at volatility and the changes of prices of securities over time. And we know there's a certain level of volatility associated with markets. We don't know for sure what the uncertainty is in markets and where the stock market is going to be in 30 years. And so it's really, it's as a board member, it's really good to bear in mind that there's risks that are present and you plan for, and there's risks that you don't know are present and are really hard to plan for. And those are two very distinct items. My half a comment, which I'll save mostly for the next meeting, is on the context of trying to define risk in the context of a risk budget. Unlike a capital allocation framework where it's very easy to calculate the dollars that you have invested, active or passive, a risk budget is going to require a forward-looking calculation of the relative risk in the portfolio. And so as a consequence, from a policy perspective, what's going to matter to you is not just the policy level of relative risk, whether it's 40 or 50 basis points in global equity, but what's the calculation to come up with that forward-looking estimate? Is it a conservative? Is it an aggressive one? How does it compare to other calculations? And importantly, what's the process for calculating that? Is it an external figure that a outside group comes up with independent of staff? Does staff calculate that themselves? That's another sort of governance question to answer down the road.
Thanks, Steve. Okay. We look forward to the item coming back. The goal, again, would be to be able to implement July 1st of 2020. So a lot of work that has to happen between now and then. Look forward to that information coming back to us for action. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Rosalind, did we have any information requests?
There were no requests for information.
Thank you. Item 10 is the draft agenda. The next meeting will be the semi-annual reports, both in open session and closed session. We're having, Chris and the team has arranged to have a speaker from BlackRock be with us as well. We have about 5.5, maybe 6 hours for investment committee at our next meeting in March. Anything else you wanted to highlight at that, Chris?
Only you just said it. I just want to, for Denise's standpoint, March and September are always our longest meetings because that's when you get your semi-annual reports. I generally ask the consultants in March to be short and concise because you're looking at a 6-month time period and calendar year returns that don't go into the benefits. Chris is passing out a revised agenda because we had some mistakes on the other ones. We have lots of investment policies that are coming back as well as the semi-annual. It may change and shorten because this meeting is exactly 30 days, which means the agenda is pretty much, from my staff standpoint, the agenda is due. And so if we can get those in, then, but we are looking forward to having Brian Deese from BlackRock. I think it'll be very helpful, given Larry Fink's recent letter. He also was a high-level official in the Obama administration and has some really good insights. Kirsty and I have met with him many, many times. And I think it'll be helpful to hear what they have to say and what their actions are going to be on climate.
We look forward to that. Jack?
Just to clarify the schedule, though, with Chris' comments, the investment committee is long, and we were picturing the Wednesday, Thursday, Friday sequence. Wednesday would be that investment committee kicking off the day. But the other work plans aren't that long. So when I went over them yesterday with Sharon and Harry, it really does look like a full 2-day meeting. So that on the first day you could do investments and audits, and then on the second day start the day with a pretty substantive compensation committee, but then a very light agenda depending upon how we finish the fiduciary RFP for the board, and then an appeals committee. So I think right now probably it's just Wednesday and Thursday for March.
We'll update everyone as we get closer to that. That's good. Thank you for that, Jack. All right, for now, we're going to adjourn from open session. We're going to break for lunch, and we'll come back to closed session at 1:45. Okay?
We're going to come back out here for closed
Yeah, we'll have closed session here at 1:45.